Every year, we're looking for the new flagship smartphone from Apple to bring something to the table that revolutionizes the smartphone industry. And this year, we didn't really get that. We got a group of smartphones of which their names are barely being accepted. But like it or not, these are the iPhone 13 Pros. And regardless of this year being more about mundane updates, I'd say these are easily the best pair of flagship smartphones you can buy right now if you're impartial to different operating systems. I'm Miles Somerville, this is 9 to 5 Mac, and here's why. The 13 Pro honestly leaves very little to be desired as far as the design's concerned. The 13 Pro represents the second iteration of the stainless steel flat edge with a frosted matte glass back, and I gotta say, it's still such a clean design overall. Feel in the hand and usability is generally better for me with some sort of case because of the hard edges, but outside of that, it feels really great. And I will say that the experience on the Max is slightly different because of how big it is. Keep in mind that the 13 Pro Max is my personal daily driver, but I feel as though it could be a bit skinnier so people with smaller hands can have better usability. This is definitely something I've heard many people say, that the Pro Max is just too wide to use every day, especially for one-handed stuff. And that hasn't really been the case for me personally, but I can totally understand why that's been the case for others. And with that being said, I think Apple should definitely consider tweaking the proportions a bit for the Max in the next generation. The notch housing the earpiece speaker, camera, and Face ID sensors has gotten about 20% smaller this year, and in my initial top features video, I said that this is a pretty negligible change, and as far as functionality, that remains to be the case for sure. There's nothing done from a software perspective to take advantage of this small increase in space on the display, but the visual appearance of the notch is pretty noticeable if you've got a 12 series model to compare. That being said, the selling appeal of this change to the average consumer is likely going to be pretty trivial, and I think more people will pay attention once the notch actually goes away in some form. The camera lenses have also gotten slightly larger in size, and I think this was more of a symbolic move on Apple's part, more than making room for better hardware inside. Apple always goes heavy on the camera system with the Pro model iPhones, and I think that they want this to be very camera dominant from a design perspective. They want people who see this phone through the Apple Store window to think that, hey, this has got a killer camera system on it, and you do that by having big, pronounced lenses. One way I judge a product's design is by how well it holds up over time, and after nearly a year of using the 12 Pro, it's still as clean as ever, and that same structure is being carried over to the 13 Pros, which I'm not going to complain about. The display on the iPhone has been really good for a while now, but we all know that the flagship models were definitely lacking on the refresh rate front. Apple introduced their high refresh rate tech called ProMotion years ago on the iPad Pro, and now we finally got it on the iPhone. The display is now capable of a 120Hz refresh rate, but with the way ProMotion works, it isn't necessarily constantly running at that high refresh rate. ProMotion utilizes an adaptive refresh rate, so for certain tasks the display could be at 30Hz or 60Hz or 120Hz depending on what you're doing. The main benefit and purpose of an adaptive refresh rate is to preserve battery life, because if the display is running at 120Hz non-stop, you're not exactly going to have a battery that lasts the whole day. And because of this, I've seen people saying things along the lines of this not being a true high refresh rate smartphone compared to its Android competitors, and I don't agree with that at all. When using this phone on a day-to-day basis, you can definitely tell the difference in comparison to the 12 Pro. Scrolling through timelines, swiping around on my keyboard, all have this enhanced smoothness. ProMotion is definitely doing its job if you ask me. We're gonna dig into battery life a little bit later, but I will say that ProMotion does not compromise battery performance on either models, and that this is a no compromise feature that everyone should appreciate as they get used to it. Outside of ProMotion, the only new change to the display is the increased maximum brightness. The display on the 12 Pros went all the way up to 800 nits for standard content and all the way up to 1200 nits for HDR. The new maximum for standard content is 1000 nits, which is a noticeable increase. But as far as daily usability is concerned, it wasn't something I felt the iPhones needed really. 800 nits of brightness on a display is not dim at all, and outdoor visibility was never a real problem for me that I experienced on the 11 and 12 Pro, so I honestly wonder why Apple bothered, but hey, I'm not going to complain about it. While to some these updates may seem somewhat mundane, you have to keep in mind that these are merely additions to an already fantastic screen. Colors, sharpness, brightness, and viewability on the 12 Pros were already fantastic, and so adding what they have has just made it even closer to perfect for everyday use, at least for me. You can't tell me that you're buying a new iPhone for better performance. You just can't. This phone is already so smooth and so fast, like 98% of the time, for games, web browsing, social media, capturing photos and videos. You cannot tell me that you're buying the iPhone 13 because of the A15 Bionic. This processor is about 10% faster than the A14, and that's due to a new 6-core CPU with a 5-core GPU and 16-core neural engine. And this update as far as visual performance differences are so minimal that I think ProMotion makes the phone feel faster than the A15 does. Now, there's always more to the story with the new processor than just pure performance figures. You must always factor in any improved efficiency or software optimization that the chip provides. And that's kind of the way I see this A15 update. I think the processor is probably doing more on the efficiency and optimization front than on the performance front. The new camera software features and ProMotion all need a processor capable of optimizing it, not to mention the ProRes video optimization you'll get. And the A15 is doing a great job at all of that. But if you're just looking for better performance, you could wait till next year or the year after. Besides there not being any revolutionary features being added this time around, the 13 Pro's camera overall is the best stock camera system on any smartphone, in my opinion. The 13 Pro and Pro Max retain the triple lens camera setup this time around, and they've added to this experience even further. On a hardware front, not a whole lot has changed for the most part. The main wide-angle lens now has an f1.5 aperture instead of an f1.6, and the ultra-wide lens now has an f1.8 aperture instead of an f2.4, but the telephoto lens has actually dropped down to an f2.8 from an f2.0 in the 12 Pro, but I think the main reason for that is because the focal length has also gone up to 77mm from 58mm in the 12 Pro, so overall depth of field feels extremely similar. As far as pure differences in image quality between this year and last year, you're going to be hard-pressed to find any major differences for regular photos. And I think one of the biggest letdowns of the 13 Pro's camera is that Apple didn't fix the light artifacting issue. The iPhone's camera still gives off this weird light artifacting effect when the camera is facing a direct source of artificial light. And I honestly thought this was something highlighted enough by the press for Apple to resolve this issue, but still here, which is definitely disappointing. But besides that issue, this is more or less the same quality camera as last year, and that's nothing to be sad about because the 12 Pro already has a great camera system. My personal favorite camera feature this year is the addition of a macro mode for the ultra-wide angle camera. You simply place the iPhone extremely close to a subject and you'll notice a jump in the detail of whatever you're focusing on. I haven't tried a bunch of macro lenses on smartphones, but this is by far the best I've tried. The detail coming out of photos on this lens is honestly incredible for what you're shooting it on. And I think it's also ironic given the fact that the ultra-wide angle lens is generally the lowest quality of the three. When out and about taking photos, I personally found myself getting extremely close to a lot of objects just to capture a bunch of macro photos. It's a lot of fun and something that I think will catch on in a huge way in the future. And that's partially due to the fact that macro mode works for video as well. So you can capture some really interesting stuff being able to get that close to objects and people and record it in video form. Photographic Styles is the big software feature for the iPhone's photo system this time around, and you can basically think of Photographic Styles as live customizable photo filters. There's 5 different presets to choose from, and within those presets you can tweak the tone and the warmth. And I think for pre-planned photos being taken, this is a pretty neat feature. It gives you a basic sense of what photos could look like with an edit before you fully commit to it. I don't think I'll use this feature most of the time because I'm so snap and go with my photos. A lot of the time I'm just thinking about getting the moment captured rather than seeing how it can be tweaked before the photo is actually taken. If this were omitted from the iPhone altogether, I wouldn't miss it quite honestly, but I think it's a neat addition overall. On the video end of things, the hot new feature for the 13s is cinematic video, and this is effectively just portrait mode video with new focus locking features. photos. This is entirely a software-driven process, and so you can actually edit what the camera focuses on after the fact. And I don't think this feature is as interesting as the Dolby Vision HDR video recording, which was introduced last year, but I think that this could introduce a whole new wave of mobile videography. You can definitely bet on other companies trying to emulate this effect for their future smartphones. The tracking works pretty well overall from my testing, and for a subject that isn't moving at an abnormal speed, it'll pretty much stay locked on until you pick another focus point. And if the subject view is being blocked temporarily, it usually has no problem finding it again and locking on. This mode also lets you adjust the aperture of the lens, but it's basically an intensity slider for the digital blur being applied to the video. You're not actually letting in more or less light. And the biggest thing that people have pointed out with this mode is that while this is recording video in HDR, it's locked to 1080p at 30 FPS. The 1080p part of this is pretty negligible if you ask me, because when I'm looking at cinematic videos I've taken, I'm not thinking about how it looks like a 1080p video, because it doesn't. It just looks like video taken on a smartphone. But the frame rate part of this is really interesting because the standard for cinema is 23.98 frames per second. So what is Apple trying to insinuate? Is Apple's definition of cinema 1080p at 30 FPS? I don't think any of Apple's TV Plus shows are filmed in that 30p, so the messaging here is a little inconsistent, but other than that, I think this feature is really cool and genuinely fun to use. And ProRes video recording was announced for the 13 Pros, but we're still waiting on actually getting that feature. So unfortunately, covering that will have to be a video of its own. But as many have said, you should not buy a product for a feature that isn't currently available. You don't know how well it's going to work, if it's actually going to be beneficial for your workflow. It's a big question mark. So for now, it's better to act as if Apple just never announced ProRes video when factoring in your purchasing decision, but I am very much looking forward to seeing how well it works. But once again, these are all of the things being added to an already great camera system. You've got Dolby Vision HDR video recording up to 4K at 60 FPS, great low light capability, portrait mode and portrait lighting, and built-in RAW for photos. There simply aren't any other smartphones that provide this experience for photos and videos in one package, and that's what makes the 13 Pro the best camera system on a smartphone. Arguably, my biggest complaint with the standard 12 Pro from last year was battery life. Coming from the 11 Pro Max to the 12 Pro, I was not feeling the overall battery performance I got, and that's why I stuck with the 12 Pro Max as my daily driver. The battery on the Max phones have always been great, and this year is no different. Even with the 120Hz panel, battery performance seems to be even better than last year. The 13 Pro Max, pretty much no matter what, is a true all-day battery smartphone. I can easily get 6 to 7 hours of screen on time with light to moderate usage throughout the day. The battery improvements on the 13 Pro Max are noticeable, but not necessarily significant given the 12 Pro Max's already great battery performance. It's the smaller 13 Pro that has the much more noticeable jump in battery life. The 13 Pro still isn't quite on the same level as the Pro Max, but the overall battery performance is far more usable for my needs than last year's Pro. I can easily get 5.5 to 6 hours of screen on time, which is a very noticeable improvement. And I think that this improvement puts the 13 Pro and Pro Max at a somewhat even playing field. Now there aren't any exclusive camera features on the Pro Max, and because of the improved battery life, everything is close to the same on both models, and I think this is how it should be. One Pro model shouldn't be more Pro than the other. Unless you're coming from a 12 Pro or Pro Max, these devices are a pretty huge update. If coming from an 11 Pro or earlier, you're going to get the new design, loads of new camera features, better performance, Pro Motion, and the best battery life the iPhone's ever had. There's always stuff that can be improved and added to a smartphone's feature set, but I think everything on these phones just works so well, leaving very little to be desired from a hardware standpoint. You've got an industrial grade design that feels premium and durable, a display that's bright, vibrant, and super smooth, best-in-class performance, and the best camera system on a smartphone. And that's why, if you're impartial to different operating systems, the 13 Pro and Pro Max are the best overall flagship phones you can buy right now. But yeah, that's the review, the iPhone 13 Pro and Pro Max. What do you guys think about these phones? Did you pick one up? Did you get the regular Pro or the Pro Max, or one of the regular 13 models? Let me know in the comments down below, and if so, let me know what your favorite feature is. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for future content like this, because of course we're going to be covering ProRes video when it drops. We've still got the iPad 9 review on the way, the iPad mini 6 review on the way, the regular iPhone 13 reviews. Be sure to subscribe for all that. Thank you all for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.